Um, okay, so basically, I went kind of down this path where I was trying to review and understand a number of interrelated methods that aren't necessarily well connected in the literature. And so, I think it's kind of useful to bracket qualitative research more generally into research that tries to speak to causal questions and research that's more descriptive and maybe not as focused on causality. I think that some qualitative researchers would even question the idea that we're supposed to model systems and come up with these causal stories, right? There's certainly a type of qualitative research that's not interested in that at all, and would question, is that even our role as social scientists to come up with causal stories or causal models? But I think that the qualitative research that we all find interesting is very generative and very actionable. So it sort of builds and qualifies theory. It clarifies relationships between variables and constructs. Sometimes in quantitative research, we found that perhaps the causal order that we expect between variables is incorrect or maybe poorly contextualized in some way, particularly if we're working with a lot of cross-sectional data or we have non-modifiable variables. We might think that X affects Y, but actually Y affects X, or maybe there's some mediating variable that we didn't even think about, but we do some qualitative research or engage with the qualitative research and we start to develop a more complex understanding. So just one example from my own work that I think is kind of illustrative of this problem. There's a lot of discourse about phasing out coal, and it's kind of been happening somewhat, I guess you could say, organically through market processes and also through policy too. But then there's also been a few states that have tried to subsidize and rescue the coal industry. And the argument is usually that this is all about jobs. But I found in my own work in talking to folks on the ground in coal-dependent communities that some of the discourse was really not just jobs. And then when I did some quantitative research, I found that things like the number of jobs that would be saved by a coal subsidy actually don't have much predictive or explanatory power for support for that subsidy. And that's kind of the only thing that you can uncover with qualitative research. Without the qualitative research both points to a research question and also kind of helps you qualify. And there's a lot of qualitative research, I should say, done in these coal communities that would suggest that it's not really just about that they're losing jobs. It's about a loss of way of life, a sense of identity, et cetera. I mean, we've been losing the jobs for 40 years or so. And it's a more cultural question, I suppose. Sometimes for certain topics, there's not particularly good theory to rely upon or little empirical research. So in that case, qualitative works becomes really, really important, right? We can rarely do true experiments in the social sciences. Causality can be difficult to establish definitively for many of our questions. And qualitative work can help at least point to potential causal relationships that we might observe in our quantitative data. So there is a little bit of terminological vertigo, for lack of a better term. Sometimes you see the co-discovery of parallel methods. One of the points of confusion that I had was that participatory research often refers to participatory action research, or just participatory methods in general might refer to a set of methods where the goal is kind of to give communities voice, allow marginalized people to speak, and sort of it's very sort of social justice oriented. It's maybe less interested in creating this rigorous empirical model that maybe we can then go out and test with quantitative data. It's about these kind of on the ground, extremely applied methods that are really interesting questions of social justice and equity. On the other hand, there's participatory in different senses of the term that can sometimes run parallel to this sense of participatory, but in participatory systems modeling, that's not really what the participatory means. That was actually a major point of confusion for me when I started reading this literature, because I thought, like, well, they haven't started talking about social justice and equity and things like that participatory researchers are really worried about. And of course, some participatory research, it's like some citizen science efforts, are also still rigorously empirical, but not all participatory in the social justice sense research is necessarily about being highly empirical. So sorry, go ahead.
Can I ask some clarifying questions on this slide? So first, your first bullet, co-discovery of parallel methods. Can you say a little more about that? And then my second question, you can just answer them all at once, is the one that you expect to have social justice, is it participatory research or is it participatory action research?
I think that, let me answer the second one first, if that's okay. I think that people who do participatory action research would sometimes abbreviate it PAR, so it's really clear, but sometimes I might just call it participatory research. They probably wouldn't call it participatory modeling, but there are people who do participatory modeling that are also interested in questions of social justice and equity, but they're not really in dialogue with the participatory action research. So like a classic example of a participatory action research method would be something like photo voice, if you're familiar with that, or kind of other methods in that space. So yeah, the co-discovery issue, I think, is just that, sometimes there are things that look really similar that are kind of discovered in different pockets of literature that aren't always in dialogue with each other. So, for this is just one example is actually going to pivot to, in qualitative research, there's a tradition called causal process tracing, which comes, I think, partly from poli-sci, partly from sociology. In political science, like in the policy process literature, I'm sure Ryan's probably familiar with that. There's a lot of this kind of research. And this is basically where a researcher tries to look back in time at a series of events to try to figure out why something occurred, why a particular policy was implemented the way that or why it was implemented the way that it was, or why some historical event took place. And this is to kind of piece together in a kind of retrospective way a causal process, with the researcher kind of being the one that traces the steps, if that makes any sense. So typically this is used to understand how one event transpired. This is somewhat different than, this is different than the participatory modeling that we'll talk about in a second, because the researcher is the one kind of looking at a sequence of events or even a sequence of variables and saying, aha, this is how this process took place. Perhaps bolstered by interviews and document analysis and other types of qualitative data, but fundamentally it's the researcher saying, this is based upon, my review of all these bits of evidence, how this particular event occurred, how this particular change happened in society, or something along those lines. So that's related, but not exactly, I think, what we're interested in. And Chris probably knows a little bit more about this than me too. So as a qualitative researcher, you can probably speak to it better. There's also expert elicitation methods, which kind of sounds like what we're interested in, but I don't think that it is. Typically speaking, sometimes this research is interested in these causal questions and building a causal model, but a lot of it's focused on developing the probability essentially of an event occurring. I mean, that's probably simplifying it a little bit, but that's what a lot of these methods are for, at least in my read. And they rely upon some pretty wonky Bayesian statistical methods that I don't frankly understand. I could probably learn, but I don't understand right now. Typically, most of it is, most people that say they're doing expert elicitation, it's usually a quantitative method. There's maybe some research that would say we're doing expert elicitation, but it's more qualitative. As we did we interviewed some experts, and here's a summary of what they said. Sometimes though, it relies upon relatively large samples, sometimes relatively small samples. So, someone might do a survey of experts and ask them to assess what's the probability of a certain event occurring, and then tally that information in various ways. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just raise my hand. So I've been really curious about this because I feel like I've run across this as a desired outcome, developing these probability weightings. And what kinds of cases are there where getting a small number of experts together to make that up is better than just looking at whether, those events occur relative to other things?
Yeah, you're saying like, when is a small sample justified over a large sample?
Well, not only a small sample, but like a small sample of people that are being asked to estimate a probability that they've maybe never measured. They're just going by feel. I'm not trying to call it into question. I just have a hard time. Like, if somebody were to ask me, like, what's the probability of something, like a high PM event in somebody's home, I'd rather look at data than just say, yeah, I think that's probably a 1 in 100 day thing. So even if I were asked something that I'm an expert or viewed as an expert about, I wouldn't want to just make up a probability. I'd rather look at data. So I'm trying to understand when like, in what context is that like the desired source of information?
Yeah, I would say in the papers that I've engaged with, most of the time it's kind of like this wiser example here, where it's people that are actually modeling or working with data on that topic. But there may be some where they're experts from a field that doesn't necessarily try to quantify those probabilities, and they, you know, you sort of ask them more qualitatively to assess the probability. And we know that people don't have a particularly good intuitive understanding of probabilities. So unless you're working with data, I'd be a little bit skeptical, I suppose. I mean, even if you ask somebody who was an expert on a topic, but their expertise was more kind of practical and qualitative, then you know, I'd be skeptical of, kind of like you were saying, their ability of assessing something like a particulate matter event, or, you know, any range of things. Most of what I've seen is kind of in the, like this Visor, I don't know how to pronounce her name, et al. Their research team has produced a bunch of these papers that, you know, usually end up in pretty high profile outlets, where they interview people about projected price changes for renewables and other kind of outcomes related to wind power. And the people they interview are modelers and folks from the industry, and people who should have a pretty good sort of quantitative sense of, here are what costs are, here's, you know, the possibilities for deployment and things like that. But yeah, I do agree there could be situations where you're interviewing people who are definitely experts, but maybe their job is not to assign probabilities to events, and maybe they don't actually work with a lot of data in that sense. So how you would use that information, how you would use the probability of a home installing solar panels, let's say, from someone who's a foreman of an install team. Definitely an expert, right? But you know, they don't necessarily work with data on the propensity of a household to install solar panels or something like that. That's a great question. I mean, I don't really know. You're good people to talk to, but how you would use their responses is an open question to me. Certainly.
And there's been a fair bit of chat in the activity in the meeting chat, just let you know, Adam, because so people are kind of weighing in parallel on expert elicitation methods. I would suggest that you go on to the next thing, because I think the purpose here is not to talk about expert elicitation methods. I think you're bringing it out as a method. You're sharing it as a method.
Let me close the door. My kids' last day of school was today, and they just got home, and they're extremely excited. So hold on just a second, okay?
Hey.
I'll be right back. I thought they were going directly to their after party, but I guess.
But is this expert elicitation seen as a kind of participatory method? Well,
I don't know. I don't know that I would classify it as such. I mean, I suppose that it's participatory. It might be participatory in that non-social justice sense of the term. I mean, I think that it has certain parallels with things like participatory systems mapping, because you were interviewing the key difference to me is that in participatory systems mapping, the samples, it's done in a workshop, the sample sizes are often smaller. This is often done with surveys, though there are probably exceptions to that. And we're less interested in we're more interested in understanding the relationship between variables and systems modeling than we are assigning probabilities to events. To me, those are the major differences. I mean, it's still something to be aware of and keep in mind if we're interested. It was kind of interesting to read how this is used. I still am a little bit uneasy about some of it. I think some of the reasons that Ellison alluded to. But there, lots of examples from energy and climate change and in that kind of literature space, certainly. Let's see.
And I think your point here, Adam, is that this is a method that is used.
Yeah, and it's kind of to me in the same general space.
Yeah.
Okay. So participatory modeling methods, these are methods that I would say you can classify because they use people that are participants in a particular system, or perhaps key stakeholders in that system as modelers. So they kind of do the modeling for you. This is different from a lot of other like causal process tracing and that kind of tradition in qualitative research, where as a researcher, you say, okay, how did this system work? How do these events play out? This is where your data is provided by a team of experts. So in that sense, it's kind of similar to expert elicitation. So sometimes, I should say, sometimes these folks are experts, but not necessarily. You'd be asking non-experts to model their own decision making. And sometimes these methods are what you might call doubly participatory, in the sense that that a study might use a participatory modeling method, but also emphasize the participation of marginalized groups in a certain way. So there is research like that. So they're kind of doubly participatory is the term that I used for it. There's maybe a better term for that. Typically speaking, though, the goal of these methods is to produce some kind of causal loop diagram, which looks just like what they used to call 50 years ago a path diagram in sociology and social psychology, or a directed acyclic graph or a logic model. I mean, to me, these things are all kind of in the same idea, roughly. There's multiple paths how you get there, though. So here's just, one example. Sometimes the term problem system is used. And that's just, the problem system just means that the thing that you're trying to model, right? So for us, the problem system could be like household decision making. And then there are stakeholders that are involved with that system, which for us could be homeowners, contractors, maybe folks at city and municipal governments who work on energy efficiency questions, retrofitting questions, et cetera. And the modeling team is the stakeholders, I think, is the key thing. The research participants are the ones who do the modeling for us, basically. So each one brings their own unique mental model of the system. And then there's a real emphasis on conducting these in a workshop and then building towards a consensus kind of collective model. I'm sure there's probably somebody who's made this point before, but we know it's pretty similar to a focus group, right? We know that focus groups do have some limitations in terms of the fact that one person might speak over everybody or be more forceful or whatever. They're good. Focus groups are fine. I'm not saying they're not a useful research method, but they do have some disadvantages in that sense. And I've not really seen that talked about in this research, that you could have a workshop where one person is just kind of taken over and they're that sort of thing. There's probably a more technical term for that, but I think you all know what I mean. But there is a real emphasis on developing a consensus model, consensus diagram, essentially. And I think there's a case to be made that maybe that process could be tweaked a little bit. Maybe people could develop, maybe the participants could develop their own causal model, and then they come back and you have a consensus model that you build, et cetera. And there's probably somebody who's done that before too. I can't believe I'm the first person who's thought of that particular challenge. So big emphasis on consensus, though. So there you'll see this kind of same steps laid out in a couple different papers. This is from I've got a citation in my notes, but I probably should just put it in here. Pick a problem, and you're sort of supposed to educate yourself as a researcher about the problem beforehand. So in other words, for our case, we probably want to know some things about household decision making, around energy retrofits and such, which I think we already do. We could certainly learn more. And then I think one big decision for us to make is in this research, they use the term factor in basically the same way that I think we would use the term variable. And so as a researcher, no, baby, I'm also gonna be looking for this one too. Okay, good luck, baby. Sorry, my 8-year-old. One thing that we would have to figure out to do this is most of the research you start off by predefining a few factors. Sometimes they're called seed factors, where you might say, here's the outcome that we're interested in, household decision making, well-being, etc. Did the household decide to make a retrofit or not? And then it may be a few things that are predictors or explanatory factors, are also usually suggested by the research team. at the beginning of the workshop or somewhere in the, somewhere during the workshop to kind of get the process started. Sometimes it's called a seed factor. So after you do that, you're supposed to work in your workshop to brainstorm factors in various ways, and how that plays out and how you call on people who gets their voice heard. I think there's a lot of nuance and intricacies there. The idea is at the end, you're going to have way too complicated of a model. And then you spend the last part of the workshop trying to consolidate and simplify the model, get everyone to build this consensus on what factors are important, what the connection between those factors are, and so on. So this is the same thing in just the longer way. And this is actually a really nice table because sometimes all this detail is buried in a long paper. So this is basically what it means in practical terms. Get people together. Obviously, that's not a simple issue. Define a problem. And this has been informed by the previous literature, expert knowledge. You don't want to walk into one of these blind and not know the thing that you're trying to model at all, or that you're interested in understanding at all as a researcher. And then conduct a workshop that does these things. You got to pick a few of these factors a priori, and then brainstorm factors, develop a causal loop diagram via consensus methods. You can use whiteboards. There's software tools that are available. But the main output is a causal loop diagram and possibly a theory of change. And the purpose of the theory of change is to me, the purpose is to identify places that you can potentially make an intervention, right? Kind of a causal story about through all of these factors, how did this particular event occur? How was this decision made? And then where can we, if we're trying to improve outcomes, make a potential intervention? This is from a study that I really liked this table because they just said what the predefined factors were. This is a study of decarbonization efforts in the UK. So they predefined various outcomes that they wanted to see, and they wanted to sort of move backwards to model how those took place. So this is another theory of change, or another. This is one example of participatory system map that does a lot of different things. Sometimes you'll see. Usually you'll see a distinction between positive and negative relationships. That's, I think, very common to do. Every now and then you'll see a distinction between like weak, medium, and large effects, or large relationships, or links as they're called in this literature. But typically they're not quantified, right? You're not saying the correlation between these two things is 0.3 or 0.7 or something like that. They do it a little step further too, in identifying policies and intervening or sort of intermediate steps, some color coding and things like that here. But this is the kind of thing that we would be building towards in our model. So there's also another method that is kind of related that you may have heard of called fuzzy cognitive mapping, which is pretty similar to participatory system mapping, and that you're trying to create a big diagram like this. But typically that'll involve larger samples, and not always in a workshop setting. We might actually ask people to build these on their own, like on a survey platform. And then you're trying to quantify the strength of relationships, essentially. And again, this gets into some really wonky statistics, but it still is, I think, a simple idea. You basically take something like this and you might say, okay, our goal is to reduce energy demand, which will reduce bills. So what's the relationship there? What's a number that we can put on this relationship between these two factors? And that's sort of what fuzzy cognitive mapping is. That's just one example. I think these are supposed to be correlation coefficients between these. This is some like wetlands. There's a lot of this stuff in like natural resource management. It's used really often. So what do we got to do? ID stakeholders. Sorry.
Can we ask questions about this?
Yeah, you can try. I've only read a few papers, so there's actually a pretty nice software platform that was developed by some folks at Michigan State to do it, though.
Yeah, so you don't need to be the expert. It's just more, have you, so I guess I'm trying to formulate my question. And then Ryan's got a question in the chat, so maybe you should answer Ryan's question.
Okay, sure.
Well, I'm trying to formulate my question.
Is fuzzy concept method a fuzzy set method? Uh, Probably not. I mean, I think there's probably the mathematics probably have um, uh, uh, some similar origins, but that's sort of Boolean logic. If you're talking about the qualitative, what is it called? Qualitative comparative analysis. I forget the author of it. It was really big in sociology a few years ago. I mean, that's not to say people aren't still doing it, where you assign you use this sort of Boolean logic to assign probabilities to events. I think that some of the mathematics is probably related, but to me, they don't seem like they're all that related, if that makes sense. Is that what you're talking about, Ryan? The Q, I think it's called. I think it's usually yeah, I think it's usually abbreviated QCA. I forget the author of the inventor of the method, but I read the book a while ago.
So I guess my question is, there's a time domain that doesn't appear in any of this yet. Like in the causality you were showing, or in the causal loop diagram that you were showing on the last slide, it seems like somebody takes some action and then some other thing happens.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then once you go to correlations, then it's like they're happening at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And so how does that ever get accounted for?
Mm-hmm. Well, you can't. I mean, you can build in feedback loops, like they've got one here. You know, in this model, which I think gets at some of that temporal question.
Right, like that takes time.
Right.
Consumers don't there, and there's also some kind of I'm not sure of the economics word, but there's some kind of resistance or delay in the system, and there's an information lag. Like
Mhm.
people don't know that this is happening, and then the word has to get out. And so, yes, these things would happen if people had perfect information, and if their decisions were coming up regularly. But where's that? It just seems like there's a lot of lag or inertia in the system that is not really represented.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen it done, but I've actually thought a little bit about that too. Is, you know, if another dimension on these links, right? So you can define these links as positive or negative, and some research will go a step further and say they're weak, medium to strong effects or links, I guess you could say. But then you could also assign a temporal element, as in this will occur. I don't know exactly how you do that. I mean, the problem is also then you start getting into really a sort of bigger set of these kind of fuzzy qualitative. Sorry, I shouldn't use the word fuzzy. These ill-defined kind of qualitative, you know, weak, medium, strong versus like short-term, long-term. You know, what all these things mean in more precise terms, right? But yeah, that's a good question. Is, you know, how long between, like, maybe the relationship between decreased bills and decreased fuel poverty. I mean, fuel poverty is the word that they use in a lot of the European literature for energy insecurity. If you've ever heard it before. I think energy insecurity is better, but maybe that's just my, you know, American perspective or whatever. This lag might, maybe that's 30 days, right? So because we get people's bills lower, and
right. Yeah, but then the rest of the system changing. Well, sometimes you only get one decision as a consumer, and another consumer has to be the next one to take that decision. And then sometimes it just like you don't get back to it for a year or something. So anyway, I don't mean to overcomplicate this. I still am a fan of the idea of making our causal inferences explicit.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, to me, I didn't realize, I mean, I should say, you know, I should have said this earlier, but I didn't realize that before I read about this method that I was already kind of doing this a little bit, because typically if I've worked on a project, or my collaborators and I have worked on a project that's the goal is something more quantitative, like say developing a survey, we've done oftentimes this process a little bit more informally beforehand amongst ourselves, or either by interviewing some stakeholders that were involved with the issue, where we're trying to think about what's the causal relationship between different variables or different factors, to use the terminology of this literature. I just didn't know it had a name, and I never actually wrote it out this formally. It was just something like scrawled on a scrap piece of paper. So this,
Right.
to me, could be a nice method to inform. As a standalone research output, it's great, but then also as a method to inform and have better vetted quantitative research, right? Particularly when there's complex questions of causal order that maybe you can't get at if you can't collect enough data. It can also, I think, identify factors that you can potentially modify, places to make an intervention, and things that are places where you cannot make an intervention, right?
Yeah.
And to me, that's also a power of this this approach. Yeah, the temporal question is really big. I'm sure somebody's written about it. I mean, but
Yeah.
it's not in every paper, that's for sure.
Yeah. But
Can I
I,
jump
so
in on that?
what you just said about the intervention is what I really like from the community side. I feel like people who are closer to the users and the occupants of homes and so on are more likely to be able to identify the intervention points.
Right. Yeah. So, okay. Fuzzy cognitive maps. So I think we were sort of here. I mean, this is not a trivial issue. Who are our stakeholders? How are we going to recruit them? You know, I don't want to just. I'm not saying that. I'm blown by that in a second. I'm not trying to say that's trivial though. And then we need to, of course, define a problem system, which is something around household energy efficiency upgrades, I think. But we, probably need to be a little more precise than that. And then we have to figure out what factors do we want to predefine or predetermine, those kind of a priori factors that we give to our workshop attendees. Figure out a format for the workshop. I think most of the time these are in person. Though I imagine, I've seen, it seems like more recent literature, you've seen some online workshops, and then there's questions of, what software do you want to use? There is that participatory mapping software that some of the people who sort of developed this method have used, so that's one option. And then I think, after we're conducting a workshop, which again, this is not a trivial issue here, how exactly a workshop works, if that's not too redundant, but putting aside those nuances, after that, we want to derive that theory of change and identify those modifiable factors, analyze and report results, and maybe use that. So this is just a very quick and dirty example that I came up with, that maybe we start with something like this, where our outcomes of interest are well-being, cost savings, and decarbonization. And, just as an explanatory factor, we know that household income, for example, might predict upgrades, but we also know there's a whole sea of other things that might predict upgrades. And we know that well-being might have like a feedback loop here. And, we'd want to start with a very skeletal, not like fully fleshed out participatory system map, and then have our workshop participants fill in the rest for us. To me, it's an interesting method from that standpoint, because we're the workshop participants become our modelers. We're taking that role away from ourselves, which I think is can be potentially a very powerful thing as researchers. So I think that's probably everything. Yeah, I can try to answer questions the best I can. I claim no expertise, but I can try.
So I wanted to ask, I got the sense that the fundamental purpose of this approach is to understand, participants' own views of this problem and how they see the factors that are influencing the problem, or what their view of the theory of change is. That's why it's a participatory system. Otherwise, anybody can sit, and plenty of researchers interested in this kind of problem. And, a couple of questions arise from that. One of them is, who you bring into the room is going to influence what you come up with. Everybody, and so it just seems so. Some people will speak from their own. Are you trying to elicit people's own personal experience explicitly or their view of the system, because those are two different things potentially, you know. And if it is the former, that is, the whole point is we want to understand from your perspective, then it really matters who you bring into the room and knowing how many people and what kinds of people to bring into the room. And so that's the whole thing to me is one set of questions. And the other is, okay, once you figure out who's in the room, what's the role of the facilitator, the researcher, right? You're talking about presenting some a priori factors. And, you know, are you a facilitator? Are you a guide? Are you, you know, I know there's this concept of deliberative focus groups where it's actually a back and forth where you're feeding focus group members with some, you know, principles and ideas they may not be familiar with to try and help inform them, their discussions. But there's very murky in terms of how much you're influencing the outcome, right? So the question is, what's the role of the researcher? Facilitation, because you can easily influence them. So that's yeah, also.
Yeah. I mean, I think those are open questions. I hate to paint with too broad of a brush because I've certainly not read, you know, I've maybe read 5% of the papers or maybe 2% of the papers that use participatory systems mapping. But it is interesting because if you read focus group studies, they're oftentimes really explicit about how interactions took place. I mean, you'll even hear researchers describe themselves and what they wore that day, right? So you can get a sense of, you know, I'm a white male and I wore a black t-shirt or something like that. So, I mean, they get all this, a lot of times this rich information about specifics of that, the context in which the research took place. Some papers will provide a list of participants and their backgrounds, and others it's a little bit more general. So some of the better ones I've read will list, you know, participant 1 comes from this industry, they were, you know, this type of background. But there's a lot of difficult questions about how the conversation actually takes place in the room that I don't know. To me, there's a disjuncture between this literature and the really large literature on focus groups that's been around for decades. And it seems like there's not much dialogue between the systems modelers and the focus group literature that would probably speak to some of those issues, I think, very well. Maybe provide some guidance on how to actually do things, or at least give you some sense of, we made these decisions, this is, you know, how it may have affected our results in certain ways.
So we're going to run out of time here.
Sorry.
And I want to say two things. No, don't be sorry, please. So first, what I was hoping Adam would do, and what he did very well, was get on the table what is participatory systems mapping, and what we don't have time for, and it would never fit, no matter how much time we had taken at the beginning or in the middle, is how would we want to use this for our project and why? I think that's another discussion, but we needed this presentation before we could have that discussion. So I think that's a whole nother meeting. The other thing to bring up is, of course, some of the nodes are going to be fed by what comes out of Chris's work, right? And so it gives me the heebie-jeebies to think that I'm defining the variables because I'm not those people, but Chris is doing interviews to hopefully come forth with some themes that could possibly be used to seed this. I have a particular view of how I fuzzily thought this could be used in our work. I recognize all the questions, like the facilitator is really, really important. Focus groups have a certain problem. Who you bring in the room, really important. And I think those are things that we should explore and inspect and work out as a team. So Adam, thank you for giving us the background so that we can have that discussion.
Yeah, I think some of it's just also about making decisions and that we think are defensible. I think that there's, for a lot of these, there's no right way to do things, if that makes sense. You know, there's not for many of the nuances that we've discussed, I don't think there's a cookbook that says you have to do it exactly this way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, so we can make some decisions. I'd also like to take a few minutes to explain how I thought this was going to work and why, and we can update that or go against it or decide not to do that. But I think with all those pieces, we'll be better able to be on the same page about how this is going to be used.
Yeah, so this is should we follow up in the next meeting with that question, Tammy? I mean, it seems that this was what sounds like some group of you were thinking about this for the project. So then we might as well continue, no?
Yeah, I've got to see when we have space for discussion, because I think we had filled out a lot. So I will get back to you folks. We're over time already. And so I will by email follow up about what people want to do, whether we want to continue with the program we have set out, or if we want to follow up and move something else. So we'll get back to that. I'll follow up by email. Yeah, thank you, Adam. This was
Yeah, no
really
problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was fun to read all this new stuff. I mean, it was, and sorry my kids are so loud. They just got done with the school year like 10 minutes ago. So they were excited. It's how we all feel actually at the end of the semester, at least when you're teaching, I suppose. Sorry.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Bye, everyone.
All right,
Bye.
thank you. Bye.